The rivers of Europe were supposed to stop them. To the German High Command, the natural barriers of France, Belgium, and the Rhine were gifts from heaven, deep, fast, and treacherous, every crossing blown, every bridge cratered, every span mined. They believed no army on earth could rebuild faster than they could destroy. But across the water, another kind of soldier was preparing to prove them wrong. They weren't tank commanders or infantry heroes. They carried hammers instead of rifles, wrenches instead of grenades. They were the men of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and by 1944, they had become the quiet miracle workers of the Western Front. Their mission was simple and suicidal: to build bridges faster than the enemy could shell them, to make rivers disappear beneath steel and sweat. And they did it in hours. At night, under artillery fire, they waded into freezing rivers, bolting together Bailey panels by hand while tracer rounds sliced the air. They fought with mathematics and courage, with river currents and stopwatch precision. By dawn, convoys of Shermans and half-tracks were already thundering across what had been open water only hours before. The Germans never saw it coming. They had planned for tanks and guns, not engineers who could move the earth itself. This is the story of the builders of victory, the men who turned time into their deadliest weapon.
Act 1. The Rivers That Stopped an Army. This act explores how the Allied advance after D-Day was nearly halted by destroyed bridges, and how U.S. engineers transformed chaos into momentum. By August 1944, France was free, but victory came at a cost. The roads eastward were littered with the skeletons of bridges, each one a tombstone of German retreat. Every river crossing was mined, every span wired for demolition. To chase the enemy meant rebuilding Europe one plank at a time. The Germans thought the rivers would hold them. They were wrong, but not yet. The Allied advance slowed. Convoys stalled at every waterway. The tanks of Patton's Third Army and Hodge's First Army stood helpless before gaping rivers while artillery thundered ahead. In one captured report, a German officer wrote, "The Americans are powerful, but their machines are trapped by water. We will make rivers their prisons." That prison didn't last long. Behind every stalled column came the engineers, the men in mud-caked uniforms, their helmets marked with the small red castle of their corps. They worked in chaos, digging ramps, blowing away debris, assembling pontoon ferries while artillery shells splashed around them like rain. The miracle was the Bailey Bridge, an invention born in Britain but perfected by American hands. Modular steel panels, 10 feet long, pinned together with the precision of watchmakers. No cranes, no welding, only men, teamwork, and speed. The system was genius in its simplicity. Each piece could be carried by a handful of soldiers, pinned into place and rolled forward section by section. The more panels you added, the stronger it became. At the River Sang, they built one in less than 8 hours. At the Musa, under sniper fire, they finished another before sunrise. Every time the Germans blew a bridge, the engineers built a new one, faster, stronger, closer to Berlin. Patton called them the miracle workers. Eisenhower called them the backbone of mobility. But to the soldiers waiting on the banks, covered in mud and smoke, they were something else entirely: salvation.
Act 2. The Builders Under Fire. This act captures the chaos and bravery of U.S. combat engineers working under fire, when bridges were built not behind the lines, but in the very heart of battle. They called it combat engineering, but there was nothing mechanical about it. It was mud, sweat, and terror stitched together by courage. By late summer of 1944, the Allied drive through France had become a race, not just against the Germans, but against geography itself. The rivers of northern France and Belgium were swollen from constant rain, their currents faster than trucks could handle, their banks choked with wreckage and mines. At every crossing, the story repeated itself. Infantry reached the far shore, tanks waited behind. The engineers stepped forward. They moved in silence, faces blackened with soot and grease. Every clang of steel could draw a sniper's bullet. Every spark of welding could summon artillery. So they built in darkness, sometimes waist-deep in freezing water, guided by lantern light reflected on the river's surface. Private First Class John J. Grabowski, a 22-year-old engineer from Pennsylvania, wrote home, "We build by sound. The hammer strikes, the chain rattles, the water slaps. Sometimes the river sounds like it's talking back." The bridges were their front line. When shells began to fall, they didn't run, they built faster. Engineers were taught to measure their work in minutes, not meters. Every delay cost lives. At the Saar River crossing in December 1944, German artillery pounded the American bridge site relentlessly. One explosion tore apart a section of the pontoon bridge mid-river. Before the smoke cleared, the engineers were already swimming toward the gap, dragging new sections by hand. They finished the bridge before dawn. The first tanks rolled across just as the fog began to lift. Not all survived to see the sunrise. Many bridges bore names after the men who built them: the Thompson Span, Miller Crossing, Grabowski Bridge. Their reward was not medals or headlines, but the knowledge that, because they built, others lived. By the time Patton's columns reached the Moselle, the Germans had learned to fear the sound of steel hitting water. It meant their rivers, their last natural defenses, were about to vanish again. Act 3. The Bridges of Speed and Strategy. This act reveals how engineering speed became a strategic weapon, how American ingenuity and coordination turned minutes saved into miles gained. By autumn of 1944, the rivers were no longer obstacles, they were gateways. The U.S. Army had transformed bridging into an art form, measured not in tonnage but in time. What began as desperation had evolved into choreography. Every piece, every truck, every man had a place in a dance of logistics that would soon redefine warfare. Commanders began to realize that a bridge wasn't just a structure, it was a weapon of maneuver. When one went up, the enemy's flank collapsed. When it failed, entire divisions starved for fuel and ammunition. To make sure that never happened, the engineers built faster. Their creed became legendary: we build or they die. In the push toward Germany, timing was everything. As Patton's Third Army advanced east of Metz, his engineers prepared in secret. They studied currents, soil strength, and approach routes even before the infantry reached the riverbanks. By the time the first tank arrived, the bridge was already halfway done. The Bailey Bridge was the centerpiece of this doctrine. Every engineer knew its rhythm by heart: pins, panels, rollers, sections. They could recite the process like a prayer. The modular frames were trucked in stacked piles, assembled on the near bank, then rolled forward across floating pontoons. At the Sellerimmer, they built one 180 feet long in just over 6 hours. At the Roar, they completed a 190-foot span under bombardment before midnight. And at the Our River, where ice and rain turned the banks into slurry, the engineers improvised with wooden planks and truck tires, anchoring pontoons against the current using ropes tied to tank tow hooks. Speed was survival, but it also became strategy. The Germans never understood how the Americans moved so quickly. Every destroyed bridge they left behind was rebuilt before their scouts even filed reports. A captured German officer confessed, "We thought they must have brought bridges with them." He wasn't far from the truth. The engineers did bring bridges, truckloads of them, carried across France like portable highways. Each steel panel was a promise that no river, no matter how wide or defended, would ever hold back the march of liberation again.
Act 4. Crossing into the Fire. The Rhine Gamble. This act follows the audacious moment when U.S. forces faced the Rhine, Germany's last great natural fortress, and how American engineers defied every prediction to bridge the unbridgeable. By March 1945, the Allies stood before the Rhine, the final barrier to the heart of Germany. Wide as a lake in places, with a current fast enough to drag down trucks, the river seemed untouchable. The Germans had blown every bridge from Cologne to Mannheim. Their orders were clear: no enemy shall cross the Rhine alive. For the Americans, it was the ultimate test. Every mile they had fought for, every bridge they had built, had led to this river. But the Rhine wasn't a crossing, it was a wall. Then came the miracle at Remagen. On March 7th, a patrol from the U.S. 9th Armored Division stumbled upon the Ludendorff Bridge, still standing. The Germans had wired it with explosives, but the charges failed to detonate. Against all logic, the bridge remained intact. When Colonel Leonard Engerman arrived on site, he didn't hesitate. "We're going across," he ordered. Engineers sprinted onto the span, cutting fuses, ripping out wires, tossing charges into the river. One sergeant described the scene as a race against God. The first tanks rolled over within minutes. The bridge shook, but it held. It was the first time an invading army had crossed the Rhine since Napoleon, and the Germans were stunned. The next 10 days were chaos. The Ludendorff Bridge was battered by artillery, Luftwaffe bombs, and V-2 rockets. Each night, engineers climbed over twisted steel to patch holes, replace girders, and keep the crossing alive. Some worked while the bridge was burning beneath them. When it finally collapsed on March 17th, the Allies had already ferried more than 25,000 troops, 2,500 vehicles, and hundreds of tons of supplies across it. The river had been breached. But the Americans weren't done. As Remagen burned, the engineers went to work elsewhere, constructing floating pontoon bridges across the Rhine at record speed. At Oppenheim, they built a 1,280-foot pontoon span in just 10 hours, the fastest major bridging operation in history. The German commander on the opposite bank reportedly stared through binoculars and muttered, "They're not soldiers, they're magicians." What he didn't know was that it wasn't magic. It was precision, planning, and the courage of men who built faster than fear could stop them. Act 5. The Floating Highways of War. This act explores the ingenious floating bridges and ferries that allowed the U.S. Army to move entire divisions across rivers, turning water into roads and speed into strategy. After Remagen, the Germans understood that the impossible had happened. But what came next left even their most seasoned officers speechless. In less than 2 weeks, the Rhine, the fabled barrier of the fatherland, was covered in bridges. Not one or two, but dozens. Pontoon, Treadway, and Bailey stretching across its gray waters like veins of steel. The rivers that were supposed to hold back the Allies became their highways. At Wesel, engineers of the 17th Armored Engineer Battalion built a 1,152-foot pontoon bridge capable of supporting tanks and artillery in just 14 hours. At Oppenheim, under the watchful eyes of generals and war correspondents, the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion created a crossing so vast it looked like a floating city. These weren't static structures, they were alive. Each bridge swayed and groaned with the current, each section held together by ropes, anchors, and human willpower. Engineers patrolled them night and day, tightening cables, repairing planks, clearing debris. When German artillery hit the river, they ran toward the explosions, not away. It was a new kind of warfare, engineering as offense. Instead of waiting for terrain to change, the Americans changed the terrain. Rivers were conquered not by firepower, but by geometry and guts. Captain Frank F. Sears, a U.S. Army engineer, later wrote, "The bridge was never finished. It just kept living. It bent, it breathed, it broke, and we fixed it. That's what made it ours. In the span of a few months, Allied engineers laid more bridge footage than had ever been constructed in any war before or since. And with every crossing, the German defense crumbled a little more. From the Rhine to the Ruhr, from the Moselle to the Main, the floating highways carried tanks, trucks, and endless convoys of men, but they also carried something far greater: momentum. The kind of momentum that crushes empires. The Germans had relied on rivers as walls. The Americans turned them into doorways. And once those doorways opened, they never closed again.
Act 6. Bridging the battlefields of Belgium and beyond. This act examines how U.S. engineers maintained the momentum of the Allied push by building and rebuilding bridges across Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, where terrain, weather, and constant combat tested every ounce of ingenuity. By winter of 1944, Belgium had become a graveyard of bridges. Every river, from the Meuse to the Sour, had been blasted, mined, or flooded. Villages drowned under retreating German sabotage, and every crossing turned into a contest of time and will. The engineers didn't retreat, they adapted. In the Ardennes, during the Battle of the Bulge, bridges became lifelines. Snow fell so thick that compasses froze. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Celsius. Bulldozers couldn't start, trucks stalled, and riverbanks turned to ice. Yet the engineers kept moving, often using dynamite to break through frozen soil and chainsaws to clear ice from bridge supports. At Ettelbruck, a bridge built by the 299th Engineer Combat Battalion was shelled 6 times in one day and repaired 6 times before nightfall. At Houffalize, engineers worked under mortar fire to construct an emergency Bailey span that allowed Patton's tanks to break the German encirclement. The Germans called these engineers river ghosts. They would vanish during bombardment, only to return as soon as the shelling stopped, hammering steel with the rhythm of defiance. Sometimes the enemy tried to adapt, sending saboteurs to destroy half-built bridges or flooding valleys to slow construction. But every trick was answered by invention. The Americans learned to build elevated approaches through swamps, portable fords for armored cars, and floating treadways that could support trucks even in unstable current. And they did it all under the gun. A soldier from the 1306th Engineers recalled, "We were shot at, bombed, and frozen solid, but we couldn't stop, because if we stopped, someone on the other side died waiting." Every bridge completed meant another town liberated, another convoy fed, another wounded soldier evacuated. The engineers didn't fight for medals or glory. They fought for connection. Through snow and smoke, across shattered fields and burning rivers, they built paths where none existed. And by the spring of 1945, those paths led straight to Germany's heart.
Act 7. The German Shock. Rivers that should have stopped them. This act explores the psychological and strategic impact of the U.S. Army engineers' speed, how entire German divisions were caught off guard, watching in disbelief as the Americans crossed rivers once thought impassable. To the German High Command, rivers were more than terrain, they were strategy. From the first days of the retreat, Wehrmacht engineers had carefully mapped demolitions, flooding points, and fallback lines. The order was simple: destroy every crossing, every culvert, every bridge. Without them, the Allies would be chained to their fuel lines, stalled for days or weeks. But something impossible kept happening. At the Moselle, a reconnaissance report arrived at Army Group G headquarters. Enemy bridge restored in 6 hours. At the Saar, a tank column crossed less than 12 hours after the span had been destroyed. And at the Rhine, observers watched in stunned silence as pontoon after pontoon appeared like ghosts on the water. A floating highway built faster than artillery could destroy it. General Hasso von Montefell, one of Germany's most respected armored commanders, was said to have slammed his hand against the map table, exclaiming, "They do not build like men, they build like the devil himself." German strategy had been built on time. The time rivers would buy them, but the Americans had erased time itself. Every destroyed bridge now meant nothing. Every defensive line turned obsolete overnight. Intelligence units tried to calculate how it was possible. They believed the Americans must have entire bridge factories hidden somewhere in France. One intercepted German radio message read simply, "Their bridges appear faster than our reports." But there was no magic, no hidden factory, only precision and will. Each engineer company worked as part of a living system. The trucks that carried the Bailey panels arrived in pre-sequenced order. The pontoon boats were numbered and assigned like chess pieces. Even the bolts and pins were organized in crates labeled for rapid access. Wherever a river tried to stop them, the engineers were already waiting with blueprints and grit. They didn't just react, they anticipated. And that anticipation destroyed Germany's last hope of slowing the Allied advance. From the ruins of Remagen to the rolling plains of the Ruhr, entire divisions found themselves trapped, their retreat routes erased not by bombers but by builders. A German colonel later admitted during interrogation, "We never believed men could build so fast. We were wrong. We lost the war to the engineers."
Act 8. The Road to Victory. Building through the ruins. This act portrays the final months of the war, when U.S. Army engineers turned wrecked Europe into a living supply network, building bridges, roads, and causeways through ruins while the front lines surged toward Berlin. Spring 1945. Germany was collapsing, but the war was not yet over. Cities lay in ruins, bridges lay in rivers, and the Allied supply chain stretched over hundreds of miles of shattered ground. Every truck, every shell, every ration had to cross what the enemy had destroyed. And once again, it was the engineers who made it possible. Across the Rhineland, the engineers became architects of momentum. They didn't wait for orders, they acted. Roads were cleared, railways rebuilt, and bridges resurrected from twisted wreckage. Town after town, the same scene repeated: a smoldering riverbank, a cratered crossing, and the rhythmic clang of steel on steel as new spans rose from the ashes. At Worms, engineers rebuilt the city bridge while artillery still echoed in the distance. At Mannheim, pontoon causeways carried tank divisions through bombed harbors, their reflections shimmering in burning oil. At Cologne, the shattered cathedral stood guard over a Bailey bridge that linked the western and eastern banks of the Rhine, a bridge built from the bones of its own ruins. It was here that one engineer, Sergeant George T. Wilkins, scribbled a note in his field log. "We're not just crossing rivers anymore. We're crossing the end of the world." For the German civilians who watched from the rubble, the sight was surreal. Americans building what their own armies had destroyed. The sound of hammering replaced the sound of shelling. And in that sound, they heard the beginning of something new. When the Allies reached the Ruhr pocket,
logistics became warfare. Engineers constructed over 50 bridges in a single week, moving troops and supplies faster than any army in history. Their roads carried not only tanks and artillery, but also ambulances, refugees, and relief trucks. The builders of war had become the bringers of order. Every bridge was both a weapon and a promise, a connection forged in the middle of chaos. By May, as Berlin burned, the rivers of Germany no longer divided anything. They had been conquered, not by bombs, but by builders.
Act 9. The Legacy of the Bridge Builders. This act explores what became of the U.S. Army engineers after victory, how their wartime innovation shaped not only the post-war reconstruction of Europe, but also the world's understanding of engineering itself. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the soldiers who carried rifles went home to parades. The engineers went home to blueprints. But the war had changed them, and through them, it changed the modern world. In less than 3 years, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had built over 3,000 major bridges, repaired thousands of roads, and constructed hundreds of miles of supply lines across 2 continents. Their improvisation under fire became the foundation of modern military and civil engineering. The lessons they learned on the battlefields of Europe would rebuild cities, highways, and nations. The same modular Bailey design that once carried Shermans across the Rhine was soon being used to reconnect the broken arteries of Europe, in France, in Holland, even in Germany. For years after the war, Bailey bridges stood as silent monuments to the builders who had erected them amid smoke and chaos. In the United States, many of those wartime engineers found new callings. They joined infrastructure projects, hydroelectric programs, and city planning initiatives. Their experience under pressure gave birth to new fields of rapid construction and disaster response engineering. And yet, they never saw themselves as heroes. When interviewed decades later, most of them spoke not of glory, but of duty. Sergeant Harold Dean, 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, said it best. "We didn't fight the enemy, we fought the clock." That humility became their legacy. They proved that courage wasn't only in charging forward, it was in staying put, hammering through the night, and building something the world could stand on. The Bailey Bridge became a symbol, a metaphor for resilience. Long after the tanks were scrapped and the front lines forgotten, these bridges remained in use, weathering storms and floods, quietly serving the peace they had helped win. In towns across Europe, children would one day cross those same spans to school, unaware that the steel beneath their feet had once been assembled under fire. The war had shown humanity its worst, but in the hands of its builders, it also revealed its best.
Act 10. The Bridge Between War and Peace. This final act brings the story full circle, from rivers of war to rivers of peace, honoring the builders who transformed destruction into creation, and leaving viewers with a timeless call to remember and to build. The rivers of Europe no longer roar with gunfire. The bridges that once trembled under tank treads now carry school buses, bicycles, and morning commuters. The same steel that echoed with war now hums with life. When historians speak of World War II, they name the generals, the battles, the weapons. But the men who turned rivers into roads rarely appear in those pages. Yet without them, the war would have drowned in its own geography. They were the quiet architects of victory, men who fought without hatred, who built while the world burned. In their hands, chaos became symmetry, destruction became design. They taught us something that still echoes today, that creation, even under fire, is the ultimate act of defiance. Long after the last shot was fired, their bridges endured, not just in metal and rivets, but in principle. The courage to build, even when everything around you falls apart, is the courage that rebuilds civilizations. In a war defined by speed and destruction, they proved that progress could be built one bolt at a time. And when the rivers of history rise again, when nations fracture, when humanity stands divided, perhaps we will remember these men who in the darkest hours chose not to destroy, but to connect. The Germans never knew the Americans could build bridges in hours, but the world will never forget that they did. In every generation, there are those who destroy and those who build. The bridge builders of World War II showed us which legacy endures. Today, when division runs deep and the world feels fractured again, we remember them, not for the wars they fought, but for the connections they forged. If this story moved you, share it. Let it cross another river. Subscribe to Hidden Frontlines, where we honor the untold builders, dreamers, and fighters who shaped history not through fire, but through courage.